For the first day, there are 3,200 marchers in line.
Not many women are coming into law school. Few, if any, blacks and people of color generally. There just aren't opportunities.
James H. Meredith is formally enrolled at the University of Mississippi.
Law had for so long been used against minorities without a realization of how much it could have been used for minorities.
President Johnson names Thurgood Marshall to replace Justice Tom Clark on the Supreme Court.
And CLEO fit in this way. It advanced the agenda.
I certainly don't think that CLEO was ahead of its time. I think CLEO was right on time.
Hello, and thank you for joining us as we explore an important chapter in the history of diversifying the legal profession. I'm Dana Morris, Assistant Dean of the University of Maryland School of Law in Baltimore, and I'm here today to moderate and facilitate a conversation about the founding of the Council on Legal Education Opportunity, widely known as CLEO. Welcome. CLEO was founded in 1967 with the mission to remedy the racial imbalance in the legal profession. Joining me for this historic reminiscence are two architects of that effort, two accomplished legal scholars who were very busy from 1968 through 1970, building the foundations of what continues today. Robert O'Neill is former president of the University of Virginia and is currently professor of law emeritus and university professor emeritus, and also director of the Thomas Jefferson Center for the Protection of Free Expression. Robert Summers is the William G. McRoberts Professor of Research in the Administration of the Law at Cornell University Law School. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us here today, decades after that historic effort.
We're very pleased to be here.
Delighted to be with you.
So, gentlemen, beyond CLEO, what do you remember about 1968 in terms of the country's history?
I can say a little bit here, Bob. In late 67, early 68, there were protests against the war in Vietnam.
The worst race riots.
There was considerable racial unrest of different kinds. The Black Panther Party was very much in the news. There were the Detroit race riots. There was an exodus of whites from cities into suburbia. And of course, Martin Luther King is killed on April 4th, 68. April 11th, 68, the Civil Rights Act passed, aimed at ending racial discrimination in housing, and President Johnson signed it immediately.
The time is here. Action must be now.
Those are some of the major things that in the forefront of my recollection. Robert, you've got more to say.
It was a time of turmoil. Many college and university campuses had been the site of sit-ins, protests, which by early 1968 were already becoming fairly violent, and by the late spring of 68 had essentially displaced the normal educational process. So I recall it particularly as a time of trauma and turmoil, especially focused on the Vietnam War.
Gentlemen, we all know about the state of diversity at that time. Minorities represented about 1% of the legal profession. The American Bar Association had begun to accept people of color in the previous decade. Black and Hispanic law students were almost exclusively being graduated by a handful of schools, most notably Howard University.
At a time when there were so few minority lawyers, fewer still who would be teaching in liberal arts colleges, you were unlikely to have those pre-law advisors who were so crucial in opening up opportunities for lower and middle class white students. Second is that preeminent selective law schools weren't going recruiting at historically black or predominantly minority institutions. Third was a sense that standardized tests were, let's say, no friend of minority students. So if given a choice between going and taking the law school admission test or the medical college or the graduate management test and doing something else like going straight into business or a military or something else, I suspect that the deterrent effect of the standardized tests probably had more of an effect on excluding or discouraging promising, able minority students than any of us realized at the time.
They were afraid of the test, afraid to take it.
Why do you think that was?
Well, they hadn't had experience with it, and they thought, secondly, it was from a profession that had been foreign to their history and tradition and interests. They didn't see it as a friendly process. And sometimes, indeed, I can recall conversations with some of them, they thought maybe it was designed to keep them out.
Do you have a sense of how many African American attorneys there were relative to the population during this time?
I recall my father-in-law, who recently died at the age of 102, returning from a meeting of the University of Chicago Law School Board of Visitors and expressing his deep disappointment when he said, you know, there were more black students in my class, that was for him in the mid-1920s, than there are in the current third-year class at this law school. There was increasing awareness of dramatic underrepresentation of minorities in the legal profession. One statistic I remember, in the entire state of Mississippi, there were 17 African American attorneys serving a population of roughly 1 million, whereas the white population, roughly the same size, was served by 450 or so. The ratio was 1 African American attorney to 16,000 black citizens, 1 white attorney to 440 white citizens.
There was a growing awareness of the inequality of opportunity for blacks to become lawyers. The tiny numbers, looking back, of blacks in the legal profession across the country, really very shocking indeed. There was a growing awareness that we had to figure out ways to get the law on the side of black people, of minorities. We needed more black lawyers to do this, too. And here was the basic idea of CLEO.
That basic idea was to create summer programs at a select group of law schools to give minority students who might be interested in a law career exposure to first-year law courses. These summer institutes were inspired by programs at Harvard Law School and the University of Denver, but were ultimately modeled after the Emory University example, where Nat Kazansky administered their Pre-Start Institute program.
Emory Pre-Start was just as simple a concept as you could think of. Here it is, you get to go to law school, just like anybody goes to law school. You got real teachers teaching the same course they teach in law school. You got a test, you pass it, you stay. You fail, you leave. That simple. The yield was phenomenal. Rarely did anybody fail.
I think the Harvard program had the benefit of a highly visible minority person, Walter Leonard, who later became president of Fisk University and has achieved much in African American higher education. He was then at the Harvard Law School, and he played a critical role in those early institutes. But why Harvard, why Emory? Not entirely clear. They simply did go out front. And then the question, is that all when you get to 1968? Clearly those were programs that were likely to emphasize opportunities for African American students. That left about 3/4 of the country essentially uncovered. So it figured that places like Denver and UCLA, chosen as the sites for the other two, would complement this Eastern emphasis by providing more opportunities for Hispanic and possibly Native American students.
I would bet that funding played an important role in the success of those programs. How were those programs funded?
By '68, 2 critical commitments had been made. One by the Office of Economic Opportunity, OEO, which had pledged support for the administration of the CLEO office. The support of the students was to come from the Ford Foundation. Interestingly, until fairly late in '67, it had been assumed that the private component would come from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Somehow, I think thanks largely to the intervention of William Pincus, a program officer at the Ford Foundation, Ford became the primary private funder. But as with all good foundation grants, it was of limited duration. Basically, what the Ford Foundation said is, we'll get you started. We'll provide for the support of the students for the first 2 years. After that, the law schools in which these students enroll will have to provide for the 3rd year. And after the Ford grant had run out, the law schools were then expected to provide support for the students, indeed, starting in the 1st year. So the obligations imposed on the legal education community were inevitably increased once this very generous seed money grant from the Ford Foundation played out. The Office of Economic Opportunity, OEO, was to continue, indeed, I guess to this day, as a major source of support.
Were there any other conditions to that
Yes.
Ford Foundation grant?
Yeah, there are actually several conditions. One, that students had to be admitted after the summer program to a law school superior to one that they would have been admissible to on their own. In other words, let's say the sponsor of the institute, the host of the institute, couldn't simply admit out of the summer institute students that they would have admitted anyway. The whole focus of the summer institute was to give these students an opportunity that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So that was one very clear stipulation. The other stipulation, which we think came from Ford and or OEO, was that at least half the instructors in these summer institutes must be members of minority groups. Much of this happened before either of us was involved. They had come together to create originally something that was described either as Legal Head Start. It had various different names. The name Council on Legal Education Opportunity apparently was chosen at a meeting in December 1967. They said, we've thought that you and Bob Summers, having done such a superb job co-chairing the Association of American Law Schools Committee on Teaching Law Outside Law Schools, would be the perfect people to direct the CLEO program. After a moment's hesitation, I looked at them and said, putting 2 white guys in charge of a program like this, you gotta be nuts. I said, I can't speak for Bob, but I can speak for myself. I would be happy to work for a minority person as the first director of CLEO, but I am not, nor, if I can say so, nor do I think is he. We are of the wrong race and probably the wrong gender. Well, after a very short pause, Dean Keaton said, it just so happens that we do have a minority person who might be suitable.
Morehouse professor Mel Kennedy was that suitable candidate. A history professor, faculty pre-law advisor, and mentor to Martin Luther King, Kennedy was the connective tissue between the students who sought his counsel and the foundation's institutions that would provide the funding. Sandy Rosen was the first associate director of CLEO under Professor Kennedy.
Mel Kennedy was an extremely principled person, and on some levels, a moderately frustrated person, having come of an age when black men with a brain had limitations on their capacities to move into the mainstream of professions in the society. And one day he told me the most poignant of things when we were having that conversation, that he in fact did not become a lawyer because one of his smartest classmates had become a lawyer in Chicago and was working as a porter in a men's room or some such thing because he could not get a job or make a living as a lawyer. So he made a choice to use his marvelous brain to become a historian.
Mel was, if you will, was the public face of CLEO. Here was this distinguished Morehouse professor, history professor, pre-law advisor. He had extraordinary presence, if you will. And so he was running the program in terms of he was administratively responsible, budget and that sort of stuff. And he was our public face.
They made a superb choice.
Really?
And he turned out to be, much as he had been Dr. King's mentor, he turned out to be a wonderful mentor to us as well.
Yes.
It was a logical move to make him the executive director of the organization. And, you know, in many ways he was perfect in that role in terms of his ability to work with the white legal power structure and the emerging black legal power structure, and was a man of sufficient wisdom to understand that the program had to reach out to Latinos, to Native Americans, and would focus the program that way.
Professor Rosen predicted problems for CLEO as white students began to challenge race-based admissions criteria in the courts.
I wrote a very brief position paper to the executive committee and board identifying the risk. As a result, the criteria were changed to something like economically disadvantaged students such as. And the program could not possibly be nested here in the federal government, I suppose, if it weren't for that change.
This set up CLEO for the long haul, with more than 6,500 participants since 1968.
I was an inaugural CLEO class member starting law school in 1968.
Sanford Bishop entered the CLEO Institute at Emory that first year and credits CLEO with giving him the confidence to compete successfully in law school. Today, he's Congressman Bishop of Georgia.
A number of the people who entered CLEO with me did not successfully complete the program. But the majority of them were successful, went on to various law schools. Some went to Harvard, some went to Yale, some went to Duke, Vanderbilt, Rutgers, Columbia. And out of that, one of our classmates ended up becoming the dean of the law school at Rutgers. Others became practicing attorneys. Some were government contract lawyers, administrative law judges, municipal court judges, superior court judges. So we've had a lot of success from the group, and of course I was fortunate enough to practice law and ultimately become a member of the state legislature, the state house, state senate, and now a member of Congress.
So how does it feel to know that an alumnus of CLEO is a congressman?
It's very gratifying. I think my favorite statistic is that during the 1973-74 academic year, there were more African American students enrolled in accredited law schools than there were African American attorneys admitted to the bar in all 50 states.
Since its founding in 1968, CLEO has had a profound impact in the legal community.
At the time that Bob and I participated in the founding years of CLEO, there were, outside of the tiny handful of black law schools, there were on the other law faculties of America almost no black professors, almost none.
The issue is treating people like people so they can be what they are going to be they conservative, radical. But that was part of what it was about, to allow people to come up in our society and be whatever they were destined to be, regardless of their race, national origin, gender, or whatever.